Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. Let's see what they have to say. It's about rescheduling your build. EyePatchNotes included a little sidebar that I actually think makes a really good beginning, so I'm going to read that first. You said, I attempted to be more assertive in this parlay, beyond my typical preference. To provide a streamlined narrative, Dungeons & Dragons has generous multiclassing, at least for spellcasters. Pathfinder is much harsher to multiclass spellcasters, though there are still opportunities to excel. Some classes in Pathfinder gain nothing from even-numbered levels, instead gaining power at odd levels, and vice versa. So multiclassing even once can invert this pattern. A wizard who multiclasses once is not meaningfully weaker than a sorcerer of the same level. We'll get into details about why later. Learning about distant mechanics is a luxury, not a requirement. However, I would say there is much to be gained. My stances on games end up on extremes, either sheer minimalism or specialization. In Hades, Genshin Impact, and Limbus Company, the systems are built to work with less than what the system ultimately supports. Hades' shortest timers for a run, tight deadline, a literal timer, asks the player to finish a run in 20 or 28 minutes. If my final completion time is around that range, the method I chose to complete the run was valid, regardless of developer offerings, like if you don't use duo boons or legendary boons, but you complete the run in the shortest amount of time or difficulty or whatever, then, the game is kind of allowing that option. And so why do those exist, you might ask? We'll talk about that. Genshin Impact's romance trends toward its elemental reactions and fast character swapping combat. This is accomplished with as little as 2 characters, and is enforced in divide and conquer commissions with a partner, each of you using 2 characters. I personally consider the 3rd and especially 4th character slots in Genshin Impact to be luxuries, so any party that needs a longer rotation is clunky to me. This hold my beer like approach to challenging game build minimums is stimulating to me, since I can use Buildcraft to meet or exceed the game's expectations or benchmarks. However, it does also result in high or unfair expectations of the developer to make every game piece stand on its own. Some games are designed around mechanics supporting and multiplying each other, so stamping my foot saying I have to play the game normally is silly. I am aware of this bias, though. You clearly are. You wrote a whole parlay about it. We're going to read more of that in a second, but I wanted to respond. First of all, I think that this shorter summary of what is, I assure you, dear listener, a long parlay is awesome. It's much easier for me to do and actually cover the things you want. It's way easier for an audience member who hasn't listened to these parlay before to follow, if you care about that, which you don't have to. But I assure you it is good for the listener. And I also just thought it was cool. It's interesting that you're trying that. EyePatchNotes has been getting parlay for a while, so it's interesting to see you change the way you're framing them a little bit. That's really cool. So let's talk briefly about this initial premise. We're going to get into it a little bit more in a minute, because you got a hot take at the start of the parlay proper. Basically, the idea is you're talking about how in Hades, Genshin Impact, and Limbus Company, you could look at the game and say, well, if the fantasy of the combat, let's take Genshin Impact, is doing elemental reactions, and swapping between different characters quickly, well, you can do that with 2 characters, but the game gives you 4 characters to do it with. We might say why. It's just a more neutral way to say that. If the game's goal is to provide that fantasy in combat, why not restrict that as much as possible? I would argue that to make a good build system, a compelling build system, you probably would restrict it most of the way that you could restrict it. So in other words, you could make a lot of games' build systems more compelling by removing a little bit of space, so you can't make as many decisions, therefore more pressure is put on the few you have left. That sounds like less choice. If you make it so the player has no choices, then it's no choice. But if you bring Genshin Impact character rosters from 4 to 2 slots, you could argue some of the game gets a bit more interesting. Now, EyePatchNotes has rightly noticed that, but that also means that the developer can't as easily create other parts of the design. So for example, in Genshin Impact, you can usually perform an elemental reaction, two elements reacting with each other, with two characters, because they each have one element, at least for now. It stares nervously at Genshin Impact development cycle. Anyway, they each have one element normally. And of course, you can swap between characters if you have two. You have one on the field at once, you can swap between any in your party, so if you bring only one more, you can still do like the thing in Genshin Impact's combat, right? But it does mean that there's a narrower pool of types of things that can be good in a system like that. So, for example, abilities that have long cooldowns are just fairly bad in a system like that, I would argue, because you don't have that much else to do in your rotation. The game, is only giving you your skill and your burst, and you can do normal attacks too, but kind of two abilities to use. And so if you're not rotating through four sets of those and you're instead only rotating through two, what is acceptable as using a skill or burst? Well, it's got to be something you can use quite often, or the player just isn't left doing much, you could argue. That's a difference in design. And of course, EyePatchNotes knows all of this, but just as examples to talk about why would you open it up a little bit more. Well, another one is that there are some reactions that involve three elements, Dendro's reactions. Dendro and Hydro will make a little seed, and then you can use it for damage with Electro or Pyro. Cool. And you need 3 slots for that most of the time. But indeed, just as EyePatchNotes said, I personally consider the 3rd and especially 4th slot to be luxury as well. Then there's the whole bit about what I think is going to be a recurring topic in this parlay, is what you do to allow the player the flexibility or the lack of discipline to just kind of put stuff in because they want to, I guess. And then there's an interesting take here, right? Which is, well, if that's why, if the reason for the 4th slot, it really isn't to open up design space that much more at that point. It's really there so the player can just kind of indulge a desire to bring a character with them, which I can relate to in a lot of teams I've made in Genshin Impact. Then maybe it would be interesting to approach playing these games by not using those spaces. That would be a sort of automatically adjusting difficulty. I think a snag that maybe isn't that on topic for this parlay is that many of these games choose to reward a very well-made build with the only thing the game can reward you with, which is farming efficiency. And so I, as a player, for example, like Izandi specifically, my personal opinion is I generally don't feel compelled to, maybe interestingly restrict the difficulty because I'm making a really powerful build, because I want the reward the game offers, which is to get my rewards faster. If I'm going to, complete an auto deploy in Arknights or a domain run in Genshin Impact, if the game will let me do it faster, then I'm just going to bring all the power I can possibly bring. Which does make, if I were to manually fight, less fun, but it means I get my reward quicker, and I would argue the game needs to save me from that. It's not my responsibility to force myself to pretend that I can't do it faster. I'm not saying it's bad if you enjoy doing that, that's awesome. I'm just saying because it doesn't work for a lot of players, the game could benefit from doing something to kind of force the player not to do that. Simply some kind of reward for not using your 4th character slot in Genshin Impact would be interesting. Genshin Impact has this mechanic where if you bring certain characters of an element, 2 of an element, or all 4 are different elements, you get various bonuses. So 2 cryo and 2 hydro, you get the cryo bonus and the hydro bonus. 4 of different elements, you get the 4 of different elements bonus. 2 animo, 1 hydro, 1 cryo, you get the animo bonus, but not any other ones. You get it. Be interesting if you got some kind of bonus for not bringing a 4th character, related to that system. Anyway, and there are games that have done interesting things with this, probably a topic for another time. You could do a whole thing about this, but Limbus Company has this very interesting system. Short version for now is you get to take 1 action per character slot the game gives you, let's say 5, and that means you could bring 5 characters. But you can also bring 4 characters and give the 5th action as a duplicate to one of those 4 characters. So let's say that for a given piece of content, I've got 5 or 6 characters that would be good, but one of them is like a much better fit, a very good matchup for that enemy or something. I could just run the best 3 and give the remaining 2 slots, if I'm given 5, to that first character so they can just act more times. Yes, I have less bodies on the field, so I might die easier. But if that can be offset by the power increase I gain from getting to use the stronger of the characters, again, sometimes it makes sense to not run like the most characters the game will offer. And it also makes things that can just be fun, like soloing a fight, more interesting because you do actually get some benefits for doing that. That one character can act a bunch of times. That can be very powerful on the right characters. That's just really cool. That's neat. So for sure, I think that I only bring that up as an example to make the point that there's room for the developer to make fun gameplay that is this. This isn't just EyePatchNotes having a very extreme opinion about this subject. I really don't think it's that extreme either, by the way. But wanting to do that or impose that yourself, I do think that's unusual. But the appeal, I think you would find, is actually quite universal. Like, I enjoyed the exact same thing you're describing. The only difference is I just don't do it to myself as often. Our interest in the subject is not significantly different, I don't think. I think it's really cool. On that note, let's get to the parlay proper. Hot take and disclaimer from EyePatchNotes. Remaining on a game's default and expected or safe path is cause for longing, yearning for something more. For a Warframe example, if I saw an otherwise informed player, like who knows about these things, not using any corrupted mods, more positive stats, but you get some negative stats, and no Helminth ability, swap one of the Warframe's abilities for an ability from another Warframe, I would internally accuse them of being naive, too greedy, and not ambitious enough. Emphasis on internally. You're not going to yell at the person, except when confronted. Both Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder are not so immaculately balanced to trust in single class tables, at least without due reasoning. Nothing like an 11th level class feature to make you feel like a nervously pacing dog yearning for greener lawns. Yes, so what EyePatchNotes is getting at here is that for a lot of these games, they don't really intend you to use the sort of multi-classing feature, which here we're going to define pretty broadly as just the extent to which the game lets you kind of make something new. The game will let you play as a single class druid or a warframe with no Helminth ability, but you can do those things and gain a large power increase, potentially. An interesting type of balancing that you often see in these systems is that it's if you were to do every possible form of multi-classing, a lot of them would make the thing you're using weaker. But of course, you're not just going to choose one at random. If you choose one with intention, then yes, it clearly makes you much stronger. In many games, you'll see, I looked something up to refresh my memory to prepare for this parlay, and the very first Google search result was multi-classing in 5th edition is optimal. And I thought that was, I mean, it is, I think. Optimal doesn't really mean anything in that conversation, I don't think, but it, more or less, that's true. And we're going to talk about why. But the game, plans for you to not do that. Just quickly, I take it though when EyePatchNotes says, if my final completion time in Hades was around the range of the game's difficulty modifiers, the method I chose was valid regardless of what other options exist. I take it what EyePatchNotes means is that what would be different from that would be a game that demands that you get the power from multiclassing, right? Let's say you get 80% of the potential power of a 5th edition character in Dungeons & Dragons from a single class druid. I don't know. Druids are overpowered, right? Right, D&D folks? But then if you multiclass, you get, 20% stronger. It's more than that / the number is just a fabrication. But you get the idea, right? So I would argue that these games are balanced, almost all games are balanced, to accept 80% of the potential power. You do not need to attain 95% of the potential power. No one, not even the developers, of course, knows how to get 100% of the power, which doesn't even exist really. but the game is not balanced to demand like close to that of you. If you want to use toxic grading terminology, games are looking for you to get a B minus, not an A plus. You know what I mean? But maybe you would prefer a game that requests that you get an A plus. That would be interesting from time to time. As an aside, some of the better experiences I've had with difficulty are simply trying to attempt a game's challenge before the game says I should be able to do it. In other words, the game says, well, once you've been studying for a year, you can get a B minus. But if you try to take the test now, you would need to get an A plus to pass. And I say, hold my beer. I think I can get the A plus, which I often can't, but that's fun. That's the closest I can relate. Let's get into the multiclassing thing a little bit more because I think it's really interesting. We will definitely get into the subject of how learning about these mechanics is like kind of a luxury, but there's also a lot to be gained, and maybe what that is. If the game isn't asking you to get that A plus, then why? I guess. Dungeons and Dragons, Grungy Inns and Gorgons 5th edition is arguably multi-class convenient in relation to spellcasting. Yeah, this is a really interesting part of 5th edition. If you're not familiar, most bread and butter spells can be upwardly cast using a higher spell slot for more effects, bridging the gap between naturally and artificially high-level spells. This is actually what the author finds most compelling about the system. And it could be said that spellcasting is the shared root of the multi-classed character. Feats and ability score increases stall until the player commits to one of their classes, but spellcasting kind of doesn't. A brief example. So let's say that I'm a wizard and a druid in 5th edition. So instead of being a level 6 wizard, I'm a level 3 wizard and a level 3 druid. I have the same spell slots, mage bullets, as our dear Joe Cat one time quipped, as a level 6 wizard. So both characters have the same spell slots, the same mana, if you want. They just don't have spells available of the same level. The level 6 wizard can cast Fireball, but my level 3 wizard, level 3 druid can't. However, I can still use a 3rd level spell slot, just not to cast Fireball. And so provided a good enough spell to upcast, Shatter, if you like, is like a much worse, but kind of okay Fireball, I can upcast that to get more damage, not necessarily as much. But it's not a very big punishment overall. Fireball is maybe the worst thing you lose, the biggest loss. But the point is that you basically just get spell slots at full speed. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition categorizes spellcasters into how often they would be getting spell slots, and then basically kind of ranks them. So there are sort of like full casters, half casters, there's kind of third casters, but let's not get into that, and people who don't spellcast. And then there's packed magic, but let's not get into that. If you multiclass, but you are both of the multiclass classes are full casters, you just get full credit for progressing your spell slots and you don't lose out on any of that. Provided that you're at the point in your character's multiclassing journey that you weren't looking for the higher level spells, you lost basically nothing except for delaying those individual classes' features. And because they're so concentrated at early levels, you can end up losing really pretty much nothing. You get all the good stuff in the first 2 or 3 levels from a lot of stuff, and then your spellcasting doesn't slow down, and you can have one of the classes where you take more of it anyway, so you're still getting higher level spells. And then you got that Fireball, and you're, 2 or 3 levels as a druid, and you can shapeshift and cast a bunch of druid spells, and you still have just as good spell slots, and you can cast Fireball, and you're living large at 8th level or whatever. I don't know what we got to just there. You get it. Pretty cool. And definitely a thing that is heavily rewarded. Like you can leverage that to make preposterously powerful mid-level characters that, provided very intentional choices, are much stronger, not way more than 20% stronger than a single class character, for sure. A very defining feature of Buildcraft in 5th edition. By design or eerie coincidence, Pathfinder's multiclassing paradigm is reversed. Spell slots are tied directly to class and level, so low-level spells are all but firmly rooted in their low-levelness. However, feats and ability score increases, increasing your stats, are tied to the character's level rather than class level, the opposite of D&D. Where feats in D&D are spread out and borderline optional, steady feats at every odd level are the shared root of any single or multi-classed Pathfinder character. Interesting, so having not played Pathfinder, it sounds like it's basically just the same and probably even more universal than spellcasting. So if you're level, you're level 5, no matter what combination of classes got you to level 5, you are getting the feat or whatever that you would have gotten at level 5. You don't interrupt that by multiclassing, but you do interrupt the opposite of D&D, your spellcasting. If you multiclassed into 4 different things on your way to level 5, you have like no higher level spellcasting capabilities whatsoever, but you lost basically nothing in terms of your like raw damage stat potential. Interesting. Okay, let's take a look at an example. I think this is... Oh no, we'll do that later. Okay. A previous Parley likened Pathfinder to Hades. This is due to the prerequisite-driven and mandatory nature of selecting boons. The player cannot say no once a boon is offered in Hades, and their choice will affect future options, because that one won't be available, and they'll have others available maybe based on the prerequisites they took. While there are no duo boons comboing between 2 gods, or like 2 classes in Pathfinder, feats in a given tree do have cumulative value. Some feats can have 3 or more prerequisites, so a player is encouraged to plan ahead at least a little bit. Pondering the provided table, fighters have a smoother progression curve by gaining feats during empty levels. Quite a few classes, typically spellcasters, have power spikes driven by spell slots rather than class features. Multiclassing thus leads to a curious matrix of behaviors that ultimately fuels the author's passion. Delaying wizard progression by multiclassing once fills in its empty levels. Delaying fighter progression by multiclassing once results in power spikes at odd levels. Let me explain a little bit, at least based on my understanding. So the idea is that if you would get, you can see all classes are getting a feat every odd level. So if wizards are gaining new spell levels every odd level, and don't have a lot of class features, then they're going to get a ton at first level, a ton at third level, a ton at fifth level, but you can see they're not getting anything. They might get a few things, but they're not getting anywhere near as much at second, fourth, sixth level, right? And then if you were to multiclass once and thus delay the spell casting, you become a first level fighter and then you multiclass into wizard and stay wizard. You've delayed your spellcasting by 1 level, but the feats are in the same place, so you kind of shunt the wizard spells thing down 1, but the feats are still there, and you get a much more even progression, or you get stuff every level. You might simply prefer that. It might create a more even power curve for your character. It might result in you basically shaving off a level, where imagine like you're running a one-shot, and characters are going to be 7th level. You would have, just barely gotten to, a certain spell. Let's say 8th level for this example. 8th level as your wizard, and then all classes are getting a feat. Well, you weren't going to get spell levels or a feat. But if you just multiclass into one other thing, then you have 1 level to kill. You might as well just spend it on something else, and your wizard spell level will still get to 7th level in time, because you delayed it by 1. Does that make sense? This kind of abstract thinking is difficult, so the table really helps. And then, of course, for the fighter thing, normally it evens out. You can see like you're getting a feat and a bonus feat, a feat, a bonus feat. But if you were to multiclass once, you'd be getting 2 feats and then no feat, 2 feats and then no feat. Interesting. Maybe I'll leave this up for a sec while we keep reading. EyePatchNotes says, pondering the provided table. Okay. Fighters have a smoother progression curve by gaining feats during empty levels. Shit, I just read this part. In a system that does not normally wait for the player, but that was good planning, EyePatchNotes. The player can take or delay fighter levels to gain a feat when desired. For example, 4th level is not normally a feat level for wizards who just gained their 2nd level spells. But multiclassing into fighter at that moment creates a feat slot. This can be extrapolated to any class with empty levels. The player can induce or fill a void in pursuit of value. Players familiar with Pathfinder's multiclassing can thus extract unexpected value in niche situations, such as for a one-shot of a specific character. Well, there you go. And this finally brings us to the crux of this parlay, systemic expectations, but hold on a sec. So that's a better way to do the example. So EyePatchNotes is saying, think of it this way. You're a 7th level wizard, you got something you like, and your friend says, hey, we're doing a level 8 one-shot. Well, I have 1 level, but my wizard isn't going to get anything, so let's fill that with a fighter level, and then I get a feat there instead. Very nice. Okay, that's a much better way to do it. I don't know if this is literally my example, but the opposite, but it's much better, so I don't know what to say. Oh, and you've got another one. Okay, let's load this in. Let's do it live and load this one in as well, because you actually put in a second chart that I didn't notice, and it's really good, so we're gonna use it. And here it is. We're gonna put it up. There she blows. So this one shows this other thing about systemic expectations. EyePatchNotes continues, sorcerers, in pink here, in Pathfinder, lag 1 level behind wizards in spell progression. I gotta sit down, Jesus. Sorcerers being tied for second fastest spell slot progression amongst all classes. Wizards, clerics, and others are tied for the fastest spell progression. In a multiclassing context, there's an important nuance here. A wizard, or whatever fastest spellcaster, who multiclasses once is still learning spells at sorcerer speed, second fastest. While there are trade-offs for stepping off the wizard path, there's freedom to take first level benefits of another class while matching the benchmarks of a pure character. This is despite Pathfinder strictly separating spell slots compared to D&D. A multi-class spellcaster is always matching or outpacing someone, such as a sorcerer is still learning spells faster than a bard. Okay, so again, to clarify, you can see here that sorcerers are increasing their spell level every 3 levels, it looks like, which is slower than wizards, but you can see that were you to take 1 multi-class level in some other class as a wizard, you would still be on pace for sorcerer spellcasting. So although Pathfinder punishes the multi-class spellcaster by slowing down their slot progression, you can still make the best of it by, only slowing it down a little bit, and you're still matching another class. There's this expectation that you've kind of just moved down a spellcasting tier, which is actually pretty similar to how they do it in Dungeons and Dragons. If you multi-class between a half-caster, like a ranger or an artificer, I think artificers count, or a ranger, and then a wizard, you get kind of a compromise on your spellcasting speed. And this feels a little bit like that, which is interesting because, again, overall, Pathfinder is punishing you a lot more for being a multi-class spellcaster. You're not getting that kind of universal spell slot progression, but you can kind of not fake it or make the best of it, but you can mitigate the damage, I guess, this way. EyePatchNotes continue, there's something to be said about purity of purpose. If multiclassing directly contributes to a win condition for your build, I guess, it can appear more desirable than a lukewarm continuation of the character's current class. Pathfinder archetypes or subclasses can be viewed similarly. Can the player excise an unneeded class feature or sharpen their identity with a new class feature? However, excavating any game's systems costs time and mental load. I think I have an example that helps illustrate this topic in a different way. I've been thinking recently about how when I make a build, this is how I often feel, right? I want to use all the space provided and harness it toward my goals. And I'm going to be able to use pretty much all the space provided I have open-ended enough goals and the game provides enough flexibility. It's often frustrating to me when I feel like I can't put something in a piece of open space the game offers to further the goal I have in mind. And of course, one of the difficulties here is that the game isn't going to demand that you use every single iota of space available, because if it did, then it would be impossible to play for people who don't have the time to optimize a build that way, which just like people are busy, I don't know. But at the same time, it creates this pressure where then what do you do with a player who does have that? It's possible to have that time. So what do you do with that player? They're just going to steamroll everything. And we do a lot of the time. That's true. Again, there are some solutions, but that's a topic for another time. What I think is interesting about this subject, though, is the way that there's a difference between the player that will fill every slot and the player who looks at the slots as places where they can get like something more relevant to their build that furthers a kind of win condition for their build, right? You get more powerful, but that's kind of not the goal in a weird way for making a build, I guess. It's kind of the goal. Like, it feels wrong to say it's not the goal. I am trying to make something that accomplishes a goal that is relevant to the game. I'm not making a pure meme build. I'm making something that is intended to interact with the game in a powerful way, in an intended way, and so I want everything the game offers to support that goal. Is that really different from a player who just wants to fill all the space or gain all the levels in one class because it makes them more powerful? You could say no, but I think the trick is that I'm trying to make something powerful, not just get something powerful. I guess this is a key point for what the difference between making a build and just playing a game with a build system, or making decisions in a build system but not making a build, is for a lot of people. Again, with no strict definition, I just think this is a very important gray line for the subject. I don't know what this is. A fish is diving toward the gray line to try to discover its personality, to build or not to build. Anyway, and so my point is, I think that that's a very key. This is a very key moment in thinking about a build. You know, do you perceive it this way? And when EyePatchNotes much earlier said, you know, a player who understands Warframe and doesn't use, you know, corrupted mods or helmet ability or whatever, you know, it's easy to think of that person and say, I don't think of it negatively, but I look at that type of player, a helmet ability, and say, well, they must not have the mindset that they want, you know, everything the game offers. They want, you know, enough in the most straightforward way, which is a very different desire than what I have. I think the weirdness is that systems like that kind of don't make sense for players that don't want to make their own thing or don't want to take the most from the game systems. You know, the helmet ability in Warframe, you can swap out a frame's ability for another from a different Warframe. It's interesting because you could imagine it being fun to a type of player that didn't want to use all the space for their one goal or goals for their build. Maybe they just don't like an ability, or there's an ability they really like and they simply want to put it on a character in place of some other ability. It doesn't necessarily need to be to build toward a shared goal. Many of the helmet choices I've seen don't seem to be doing that. They're just something that the player likes or finds comfortable. Maybe a Warframe has better synergy with this survivability ability, but they're just more comfortable with this one, and it works, so that's fine, right? And what's wrong with that? So it doesn't mean it's a bad system necessarily. I think the corrupted mod one is tricky, and it's an interesting little corner case. So corrupted mods in Warframe would be, you know, maybe you can put on a mod that gives you 50% strength for your abilities, and then a corrupted mod one might give you 100% strength, but you lose some efficiency. Your abilities cost more energy. It's interesting, EyePatchNotes worded not using those as being greedy. You use the word greedy. I don't mean to nitpick terms here at all, but I can think of it both ways, right? I think what you're trying to imply is that the player just kind of balks at the idea of having a negative stat. People often newer to a game systems just get concerned that they're kind of breaking something about a system they maybe feel like they don't understand if they make a stat, whatever the game says is negative, right? Usually people come to understand through their time with the game that this is generally an illusion. Like the game's, you know, positive value for a stat is arbitrary. And so there really is no like negative most of the time. You're just making it, abilities are more expensive, but they do more damage. When you put on a strength mod that doesn't decrease your efficiency, you are still making abilities more expensive because you could have put on an efficiency mod. That trade-off is an illusion. And so I would argue that's a case where, you know, in Warframe, I would say a player that understands everything about the game would never not use corrupted mods. Like they don't really exist. I would argue that's like sort of not a different thing from normal modding. And a player who understood that but still didn't use them, we would say like they just have a weird thing where they prefer to avoid effects the game says are negative, even though they understand that they're like actually not negative in any meaningful, like that's not, it's sort of an illusion. That trade-off still represents getting a negative to efficiency, even if it doesn't literally say you do. But some players might just still insist on not doing that. That's okay. But again, you would expect that a player with all the information would, it is just kind of true that that doesn't, it's not really a negative. Everything is a negative. Any slot you use for a mod makes you lose efficiency in that you didn't use that slot to gain efficiency. And so it's really not that different in a certain sense. It's just the amount of space you have, really. And some people won't universalize it to that point, but I think a lot of players kind of implicitly understand this, even if they don't think of it that way. Many people who play Warframe who are listening to this are probably thinking, yeah, I guess I kind of knew that, but I didn't think of it that way, perhaps. I don't know. Maybe. I bet. So let's be confident. But anyway, so I think that's an interesting way to frame this discussion. Like there's an odd moment where there's something different that I, at least probably EyePatchNotes 2 wants from making builds, because we're using the available space in a different way, not just to get, are we just getting power with more steps? But it's more power. That's another critical thing a lot of the time, but I don't really care that it's more power. You might care that it's more power. I don't never care that it's more power, but that's not the only reason. Like I would still make a build I thought was interesting. I think the key for me in a game like Warframe is that I don't find the difficulty compelling, even if I don't get that more power level. So since that, I don't lose that anyway. If I reach for the most effectiveness, however I've defined that I can get, it doesn't make the game feel meaningfully easier because it didn't feel meaningfully hard to me at my accounts level already. So I guess that's why. Like, I can definitely understand how I might want to limit myself in a way that made the game feel more impactful, but limiting myself doesn't make the game feel more impactful to me. So I don't, but maybe I would if I felt like it did. I don't know. I feel like no, but it's hard to know without having done that much. Let's read the remainder of the parlay and then we'll wrap up. But a lot to say about, again, I think this really important gray line for where just using a game's mechanics becomes the experience of making a build for a lot of people. The rest of EyePatchNotes is text here. There was a little premise I wanted to read before this. There's just a few closing questions. You said, excavating any game systems does cost time and mental load, which is always an important thing to keep in mind. People don't necessarily not make builds because they don't want to. Actually, one more tiny Zandy interruption. Most people don't know whether they like doing the thing we're describing because they do not have time to do it. So when I ask a lot of people close to me, do you enjoy this thing? The temptation is to say no, but then I think, but have you done that? I don't think you've done that. I know some people are in my life are watching this right now, and we've talked about this, but it can be difficult to know because a lot of games make it time consuming to find out. Is the player willing, EyePatchNotes asks, to learn secondary or tertiary systems? For example, looking up another class's progression table in tabletop role-playing games or massively multiplayer online role-playing games? Is the player meeting expected thresholds, or falling short? When you make a multi-class decision in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, there's a group of types of players that kind of calculate out whether you met the like expected damage output of a character that was a single class or not. So in other words, like, remember I was saying before, you imagine you pick every single possible multi-class. The vast majority of them are worse than if you just kept a single class character, but you're not picking at random, of course. So the question is the one you picked delaying a single class in a way that makes up for the power enough, that you actually became stronger by multiclassing? Again, that might not be what you care about, but for this discussion, there is the idea that the type of build making we're referring to involves not losing effectiveness, or you lose a negligible amount of effectiveness and maybe gain some utility, or it's your preference, compared to, whatever you would have gotten for just doing things the regular way or whatever. I definitely resonate with this. This is a strong point for me, for sure. I often feel, for me, the goal is to use something I like or think is an interesting combination of effects. And I'm not so much interested in gaining power as in not losing power. In getting about what you'd expect normally while putting more interesting, I guess, things in the space I have, right? Making a build that is as effective as the B minus builds, but which is more interesting than the B minus builds, because that's not often hard to do. You can use the extra space to still get the things that give you the damage or whatever, but then do something you just enjoy. This is maybe the fourth slot in my mind in Genshin Impact a lot of the time, but be that as it may. Putting aside performance gains, EyePatchNotes puts it that ideally the player would maintain or lose little compared to the highest levels of play, Amalgam Barrel Diffusion. Sure, a savage blow to Amalgam Barrel Diffusion. Finally, does the system encourage cross-pollination and experimentation with mechanics, mostly implied with games that have many moving parts, but discouraged by resources spent leveling or acquisition in the gacha-like economies? Yeah, this is an interesting note to end on. Another way to gauge not the player but the game is how the game does or doesn't enable you to experiment or combine mechanics. For example, something really compelling about Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, these games, is that of course by playing through the game, you don't really have to do anything out of the ordinary to get more options if you multi-class. You just level up as normal, but you can use that space to get more stuff if you want it, to add more complexity if you want it or not. Whereas if you were to play Genshin Impact, for example, well, you want more options, but not necessarily more power. You need more resources, not the same resources or amount of time played or whatever. You need more resources to get those more options. Same thing in a lot of games, really. This is really a separate topic, in my opinion, overall. The point that a lot of games have this method of leveling or acquiring build options that is set up in a way that isn't for making builds. It's not meant to be a positive or a benefit to people who like making builds. It's just one of the game's progression mechanics or monetization features, and it happens to be kind of holding the build system hostage, but they have no relation. And you'll meet a lot of people who, because many games with lots of build options feature, a lot of grinding, because that's just how you get the build options, you'll find that people who, say they enjoy making builds seem to enjoy the grinding thing, but they're not related at all. Like, there's tons of games where you make builds and it has nothing to do with grinding for stuff. And I would argue that for a lot of people, that's maybe clouding the distinction. Unfortunately, there just aren't that many good games, I don't think, that offer interesting build options or lots of build options that don't require you to grind for them, which is a thorn in my side eternally. I guess I'll have to fix it myself. But I think it's relevant to this discussion in that it's a good way to pair apart what exactly the player is enjoying. A player might appear to be grinding for lots of new build options, but maybe they're enjoying the grinding process, not the getting lots of build options. And that's just what the game offers for the grind. You see what I mean? The player then gets frustrated, like, why are we just getting the same thing that is perfectly adequate every single time? It's like, well, because the grinding for build options, the grinding half is kind of for a different person than the build option half, but they've been glued together, which leaves both parties unhappy about one or the other half. The build player says, I'm totally on board with getting this option that isn't better but is just different, but why do I have to grind for it when I already have adequate options? Like, it doesn't make me any more powerful. Can I just have it so I can try it? But for the grind-oriented player, well, they would have nothing to grind for. But then they don't. Anyway, you get it. That's a problematic conundrum that we run into pretty much every time we talk about these types of games. And a fitting end note for this really fun parlay. This was a subject I was just talking about like 2 days ago with people in my close life. My that sounds intimate. People in my real life. Literally the day you posted this, I was just having a conversation about this subject, and then I read it and thought, well, that's slightly uncanny. So really good timing. I thought it was fun. I thought premising it with a little summary was also very helpful. I'm curious to hear what you think, but I thought it was really cool. And I thought the Pathfinder, like spell slot and feat delay example was extremely useful. That's a really, really good way to describe, for what type of person. You could almost imagine a personality test. For what type of person do you want to fill that blank space, or do you just kind of accept that it's part of the progression and that's not something you're interested in? Sure, that's interesting. Definitely more to say about that. Anyway, for now, good stuff. You want to get your own parlay like this, you can learn how to do that in the description. For now, I'll say goodbye.